All right, hello, welcome back. We are going to be continuing actually chapter 3, part 2, still talking about early modern Africa and the wider world. And specifically today, we are going to be focusing on the African slave trade. Okay, so before we get started, I wanted to give you this visual aid, which is a timeline which essentially places the various kingdoms and empires that we have talked about so far and will be talking about in this lecture on a timeline. So you can see how these places, these empires are actually overlapping, intersecting time-wise, and in some cases, of course, interacting with each other. So this is just a resource for you to take a look and kind of get a visual on that because again, I know we've been talking a lot about various empires and throughout the world, and I wanted us to kind of place it on a visual timeline. So here are key terms for this lecture, not too many, but again, we are really focusing specifically in this lecture on the African slave trade. Okay, so lecture questions for this lecture. What role does the Kamen Boru Empire play in the expansion of the slave trade? How does the presence of Europeans in Africa impact the slave trade? And what role does the Doheme and Sengao kingdoms play in the North and West African slave trade? So we're going to talk now about the role of Kanem-Bornu Empire and as far as it relates to the African slave trade. So first, this is a map, and you can see on the map there are other empires that we've already talked about in this class, like the Mali Empire, the Songhi Empire, and now we're going to talk about a more centrally North African located empire, the Kanem-Bornu. And just as a quick overview, so we're talking about an area that covers the Saharan Desert, and the Saharan Desert is massive. It is 1.6 million square miles. It is 3,000 miles east to west and 800 to 1,200 miles north to south. And the sale of enslaved people had been a constant feature, actually, of the African slave trade since its earliest days. And over time, it became a key component in the continent spanning network. For some kingdoms, economic well being actually depended upon the sale and the traffic in human cargo. But this trade also required a constant state of warfare and conflict because you were taking the humans from your enemies or the people that you were warring with, which of course had the effect of destabilizing certain regions in Africa, particularly around the central Sudan. Then, with the advent of Europe's age of discovery and exploration in the 15th century, this will fundamentally transform the African slave trade. The wealth of countries like Portugal and Spain and England, France, the Netherlands, along with their firearms and their manufactured goods, will end up appealing to a lot of the West African political parties and kingdoms, empires, etc., particularly those that emerged along the Gulf of Guinea and the Atlantic coast following the decline of the Songhi. In about 900 CE, an empire called Kanem arose in the central Sudan, in that area that's colored there on the map, located to the east of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and confided initially to the northeast corner of Lake Chad. The prosperity of the Kanem-Bornu was tied to the trans-Saharan slave trade, destined for markets of North Africa and the Atlantic coast. By the end of the 15th century, so after the arrival of the Europeans, Kanem-Bornu was trading about 5,000 captives annually. So these are this because of the geography of this particular empire, they really become at the crossroads of this trans-Saharan slave trade. In addition to this, this is also going to be a big motivator for a lot of people, again, in North Africa to convert to Islam because, again, the fellow Muslims would not enslave fellow Muslims. But this also made the Kanem Empire very wealthy and will create a lot of resentment against them by their neighbors. All right, so we're going to talk about the arrival of the Europeans in Africa, specifically the Portuguese, but Europeans generally. The Portuguese were the first, and then the rest of the European nations came after them. So the Europeans had really long known about the Saharan trade routes, but the travel into the interior of Africa was very dangerous because of diseases, because of warfare. And the maps of the region were just not very reliable. But remember, one of their motivations for even beginning exploration was the fact that they were trying to avoid being a part of this Muslim trading network. They wanted to have direct access to Asian trade. So they were really wanting to circumvent, right, these Saharan trade routes and have direct access to any type of resource that they could in Africa, and specifically, of course, the trade in human beings, but also the trade in gold. When the Portuguese began their voyages along the West African coast, their immediate goal was not to discover a new trading route with India, but rather to secure the gold, the West African gold. Europeans had been aware of the region's gold fields since the 14th century, when Sudanic gold had been imported as a raw material to mint for European gold coins. By the 15th century, the Portuguese had made inroads into the Senegambian coast, taking captives to be enslaved on Iberian plantations and exploring along the Senegal and Gambia rivers in search of sources of gold. These ventures mark some of the earliest attempts at direct European involvement in the trans-Saharan slave trade. The Portuguese will eventually establish a uh, a town, a slave fort town along the coast named Elmina in what is now present day Ghana. And this not only becomes a slave trading coast, but they also established mines, they established sugar plantations, and they're essentially colonizing this region of the coast of Africa, specifically for the purpose of exploiting the resources there. After 1500 CE, the transatlantic slave trade will begin, right? And you're going to start to see Portuguese and Dutch and Spanish and French and English all start to engage in the trade of human beings across the Atlantic over into the Americas, where these colonial powers were establishing plantations that required a very large workforce. So this is a map of the islands off of the West African coast where a lot of this slave trade was happening. And the Portuguese first laid eyes on Sao Tome and Principe, a pair of islands in this Gulf of Guinea in the 1470s. By the 1500s, they had successfully settled both of the islands, which were prized for their strategic location off the West African coast, their tropical climate, volcanic soil, which was ideal for planting and harvesting sugar. It wasn't long before that large scale sugar plantations sprang up on the islands all along this West African coast, and the Portuguese will really entrench themselves in the Gulf of Guinea. Okay, so as was mentioned in the previous lecture, the fall of the Songhai Empire is really going to have a transformative effect in North Africa because they were such a strong, stabilizing central power. So the Songhai, the largest and most powerful of the Sudanic kingdoms in the 16th century, was shattered by a Moroccan army at the Battle of Tondibi. And this happened in 1591. This Moroccan army was actually supplied weapons by the Queen of England. So again, another example of how European powers are really changing the power dynamics in North Africa. So once this happens, the situation in North Africa is permanently altered. Without that powerful central authority, a host of smaller states emerge whose chiefs saw the benefits of dealing not with each other, but directly with wealthy Europeans, rather than through this centuries old caravan trade, which had been established for a long time. These developments resulted in a dramatic change in both the size and scope of enslaved Africans from just a few thousand people in the 16th century to tens of thousands of people by the 17th century. And for much of the next century, an average about 45,000 people a year will be traded out of Africa and become part of this larger transatlantic slave trade. So after the fall of the Songhi Empire, you can see here the development of all of these smaller empires, all of whom are really competing with each other specifically to have access to European goods. And so in order for that to happen, they need to have what the Europeans want. And we know that that was pretty much specifically human beings, enslaved people, and also gold. So, amongst all of this, two West African states really emerge, the Dohemi and the Segu, and their wars will end up really expanding this African slave trade. Um, the wars of conquest that these two empires generated created captives for these European slavers. It saw a sharp rise in conflict between African states and the related growth in the trade of enslaved captives. Such growth came at the expense of the historic trans-Saharan trade network, which was disrupted and reoriented to prioritize the traffic in captive human cargo destined for the coastal slave markets. So if you remember before, we talked about the original trans-Saharan slave trade as really being this network of Islamic kingdoms that really had shared a common cultural identity. They had a system of trust. They had a system of laws. They had, stopping points along the caravan routes, which were very predictable and also safe. And all of that is going to change and be disrupted because of the introduction of Europeans in this area. And it did not matter that the Europeans were really primarily staying along the coastal areas because their impact would be felt far into the interior of Africa because these little African kingdoms will go out and try to war with each other in order to get captives to feed the transatlantic slave trade. So the city of Wada, which was located in the Empire of Doheme, along what comes to be known as the Slave Coast on the Bight of Benin, becomes the largest slave port outside of Luanda in Angola, which is a little bit further south. And it becomes a major hub for all of the major European slave trading companies, including the French East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the English Royal African Company, and of course the Portuguese, who were the original Europeans to arrive there. It's estimated that for the transatlantic slave trade, about 1/3 of all slaves from Africa will leave from Wada. And um, the kingdom of Doheme will end up, as a result of this wealth that comes from this slave trade port city, will become very wealthy and very powerful. And King Agaha in 1737 of Doheme will successfully conquer the entire slave coast, essentially consolidating the kingdom of Doheme's power when it comes to the slave trade. So after the kingdom of Doheme takes over the city of Wada, it becomes one of the most powerful kingdoms along the slave coast. And one of the biggest consequences of this is, because their kingdom was consolidated and had become larger, they needed to go farther into the interior to find people to enslave. And so warfare begins to creep deeper and deeper into the African interior. And, human beings are being taken captive deeper and deeper in the African interior as a result of that. Um, at the height of this happening, the kingdom of Doheme will initiate military actions against the Oyo people. And the Oyo people, also very powerful tribe nearby, are basically going to be absorbed into the Doheme Empire. One of the interesting things about the Doheme Kingdom is a couple of things. One is the fact that they did use female soldiers in their armies. And this really kind of, in many ways, shocked the Europeans. And so you can read some of the accounts that the Europeans wrote of these female soldiers. The other thing that's important to recognize is the cultural influence of Vandun, or what has translated in the Americas as voodoo. So the voodoo religion, that type of like spiritual ancestor worship, that all came from the Doheme Empire and then got transferred over to the Americas in the form of voodoo. So we see traces of the Doheme Empire today in America as a result of this international slave trade. Okay, and the final African kingdom that we're going to talk about today is the Sangu Kingdom, also known as the Bamana Empire, founded in 1712. And they are going to really be the ones that will control a lot of this interior trade, interior African slave trade into places like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. So really that northern part of Africa instead of so much the west coast. So when we talked about the Doheme Empire, they're basically controlling that slave trade out of the west coast of Africa with the Europeans. This is going to be more of the slave trade that is going to be happening moving east into the Ottoman Empire, for example, and also out into the Swahili coast as well. There's a really interesting video that I posted on Canvas about the Mama Empire, but they had a very powerful tradition of not only like incredible artwork, but also a really incredible oral histories that had been passed down generation over generation. So we actually know quite a lot about this particular empire as a result of these oral histories. So that concludes chapter 3, where we're specifically talking about early modern Africa and, of course, hitting pretty heavily on the results of Europeans' contact with Africa and, of course, the slave trade. We will return to Africa later on in this course, but for now, that's it.